Welcome back. Again, we want to thank you all for being a part of this weekend here at Eastside. I know there were some that have been here through the day and all that weren't able to be with us tonight, but again, we have the cream. That's all that's important. And tonight, we have the special treat of having David Maxson with us. If you don't know David, he preaches down Northwood in Tuscaloosa. David's just a tremendous student of the Scriptures. He has a way of illuminating the Scriptures in very plain and practical ways that I think you'll appreciate tonight. He's going to talk to you about making your faith your own. We've been talking since last night about how faith works, as James, the Epistle of James, teaches us. And what he's going to say to you tonight, I think, will be sort of the topper to everything that we've said. I'd invite you to give him your very good attention. David.
So I hate I could not be here for the entire weekend. We just got back from Disney today. And I was here 4 years ago when we were moving from Atlanta to Tuscaloosa, where we are now. And it was great to be with you back then. Great to be with you today. Back then, we were in a period of big changes in our life. We were moving, obviously, from a place that we had been for 12 years to a totally new place. Our youngest, Katie, was entering into middle school. Our twins were entering into high school. We're kind of going through the same sort of transition this summer in that our twins just graduated from high school, now 4 years later. And I don't know how many of you might be going to Auburn in the fall, but they're going to be at Auburn, and really looking forward to that. And this was their senior trip. We all went down to Disney World and just got back today. So I hate that they couldn't be with us today. They had some obligations, and hopefully, Lord willing, they'll be able to come on Tuesday during the meeting. But this is a subject that I've been thinking about a lot personally recently because of my kids and where they are in their life. And I know that many of you are in the same situation where you are graduated or about to graduate very soon. And you're thinking about what's coming next. You're about to turn a page, a new chapter in your life. And there's a lot of fear and a lot of anxiety with that. I really have been a little bit surprised at how nervous and anxious I've been. I'm not typically an anxious person. I'm a little more laid back. My wife worries enough for both of us, and so I normally just kind of roll with things and let her worry about the details. But this transition is something that has been a little frightening for me. Now I have great kids, and I'm sure they're going to do great. But at the same time, it's kind of a traumatic thing when you enter into something new, whatever that is. And so we're going to talk tonight about how to make your faith your own. You've been talking about faith, about how faith works. And really with the emphasis on the fact that faith is not something that you just hold intellectually, academically, you talk about it, you study about it, you think about it. It's something that you do. It affects the way that you talk. It affects the way that you persevere through trials. It affects the way you look at others with prejudice or not with prejudice. It touches every area of your life. Well, what I want to talk with you about is kind of how faith works in a different sense. Yes, it is active. Yes, it does work in that sense. But I want to suggest, kind of a play on words, that faith works. It's effective. And that you don't have to worry about what's out in the future. Not when you're trusting in God. Not when you're following God. That whatever's out there in your future, whatever successes, whatever failures, whatever trials you have, that God's going to be with you and you can persevere. There's a book that I read beginning of this year, which had a lot of research on where millennials are right now. Now I realize that we're kind of into Generation Z now, but there's a lot of carryover from the millennial Generation Y and Generation Z. But a lot of fairly recent research, I want to say that the study that he conducted, this sociologist from Notre Dame, Christian Smith, did in this book, or that he used for the basis of this book, was from 2009. Studied where millennials are religiously. And you've probably heard a lot in the media about how your generation is not very religious. And that's true, but not all of that is true. And you know how statistics work and how the media can kind of misinform us about some things. It is true that of all the segments in society, those that are in their emerging adulthood years, those who have kind of left adolescence, they're not quite adult, but they're in that middle period, 18 to 24, where they are independent of their mom and dad, they're likely at school somewhere, but also still not into full adulthood. That narrow segment in society is the least likely to go to church. Actually, only 1 in 10 of your peers that age are faithful at all in going to church. But that doesn't tell the whole story. I want to show you some of the current research that came from this study. The name of the book is Souls in Transition, The Religious and Spiritual Lives of Emerging Adults by Christian Smith, who is a sociologist at Notre Dame, and rather extensive study called the National Study of Youth and Religion. It was a very large sample of kids. It started when these kids were 13 to 17 years old. I think that was in 2004. 3,200, almost 3,300 adolescents a part of this study. And it was not just multiple choice, yes or no questions that were asked. There were a lot of free response about what they believe and why they believe it. And so a lot of personal interviews with a large sample size, very scientifically done from 45 different states. 3 waves of interviews, first when they were 13 to 17, then a few years later, and then finally in 2008 when they were 18 to 23. And the respondents in the 3rd wave, as I said, were 18 to 23. And so what happens to religious faith during this transitional period where there's a lot of change and there's a lot of flux and parents are worried and kids are a little bit testing their own beliefs and faith? Where are young people today in that segment of society? Well, this is what the study revealed. And it did reveal that this segment is the least religious, but it also revealed that they have not become less religious when you take similar studies going back as far as 1972. Which is to say that there's always been a drop-off from teenage years to college years. Usually, in the last 40, 50 years, the ones who are the most likely to go to church are kids in the teenage years, and the ones who are least likely to go to church are those in that 18 to 24-year-old age bracket. And so that's just to say that while there is a large drop-off, it's not unique. It's not something that is radically different than any other generation. Little evidence of massive secularization among America's emerging adults in the last quarter century. Well, what do young people believe? Well, more than 60%, even though they're not going to church, identify themselves as being religious. There's a general trend, though, toward disaffiliation from religious tradition, which is to say, while they are religious and spiritual, they don't necessarily go to church. Fewer than 1 in 10 attends religious services weekly. However, the belief in God and the importance of faith declines less dramatically. So while they're not going to church as often as they did when they were teens, if you were to ask them, what do you believe about God? What do you believe about Jesus? Do you believe in miracles? Do you believe in the virgin birth? Do you believe in the resurrection? Many of these same people who don't go to church would say, well, yeah, I still believe those things. And so the drop-off is mostly in attendance, not so much in what they actually believe. The majority still believe in God, Christ, divine judgment, miracles, and life after death. Most also seem positive about organized religion in the United States, which was a shock to me. That's not what I expected. This is from the book, quote, "The vast majority also have positive feelings about the religious tradition in which they were personally raised." In other words, when they're asked, what do you think about your mom and dad's faith, where they see themselves religiously, they have a positive view of what their parents believe or their grandparents. At the same time, most think that too many religious people are negative, angry, and judgmental, and nearly half say that mainstream religion is irrelevant to people their age. And so they see problems with religion, but they don't have a totally negative attitude toward their parents' faith. So what are some of the cultural factors that influence religious life? Well, there's a lot of things. Disruptions. When mom and dad have a divorce, when they lose a job, or a family member dies, or when they leave home. All of these things are disruptions that can change their religious practice. Distractions, when they get busy at school or at work or at play. That also plays a factor. Differentiation, this strong feeling among young people that I want to be my own person. I don't want to be a clone of my mom and my dad. I want to be independent of them. The postponing of family formation and childbearing. This is a very strong, powerful sociological influence on religion. One of the most powerful influences in getting people coming back to church is when they get married. And especially when they have kids. That's when you start taking your life more seriously, is once you start seeing that it's not just about you, it's about a bigger picture. Well, as you may have heard, compared to 30, 40 years ago, the median age of getting married is about 5 years later than it used to be. There are still teenagers who get married, but not like it used to be. And while the expectation used to be that at least by the end of college you're going to be in a serious relationship or getting married or something like that, that's not the case anymore. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that there are more and more women who are getting professional degrees in engineering. I was impressed. My son sat in the engineering orientation at War Eagle Days a couple of weeks ago, and a lot of girls were in the engineering orientation. That didn't used to be. It wasn't that long ago where you would just see guys. And so you have girls that are getting their masters and they're getting PhDs. And so the time investment, there's more girls that are wanting to get a job, not settle down and have a family. Well, that kind of prolongs that gap of not being as serious about religion as we used to be. Powerful influence. And with that is this idea of I want to keep my options open. I don't want to be tied down. And of course, religion does tie you down. Religion is all about commitment. It's about having a faithfulness to something that is outside of yourself. It's anti-self, even. And then interesting, one of the cultural factors is the fact that young people, millennials, are much more open-minded about diversity. You've talked about diversity in this study of James. We don't look at someone's face. We don't look at someone and how they're dressed. We want to have an open mind toward people who are different than us. And no other generation in recent history has been as open to diversity as this generation. But of course, one of the parts of diversity that we have embraced as a culture is not just racial diversity, or sociological diversity, but religious diversity, and this pluralism, this tendency towards seeing that all religions are equally valid, of course, degrades commitment to a single faith or to a single tradition. And so that is a cultural factor today. The self-confidence of youth. Now, this is, again, true, I think, of every generation. But there is a particular confidence that this generation has that says, you know what, I'm doing okay. I feel good about myself, and I feel good about my life, and I don't need somebody else to help me. And of course, that is anti-religion, because religion is all about dependence, not independence. It's not about sufficiency. It's about feeling that I can't do things by myself. I need a higher force, a higher power in my life. I need God. And so that goes against religion. Self-evident morality. Many young people see right and wrong as just obvious. And that right and wrong is basically universal within all religions. And so, you know, there's no religion that has a monopoly on morality. And so they all teach the same thing. And so why should I be committed to one versus another? I'll just kind of do my own thing and live by the golden rule, and I'll be okay without religion. That's one factor involved. And then the obvious desire to live your life however you want to live, sow your wild oats, party, hook up, all of that is a factor. Another sociological factor, and this kind of contradicts some of the things we've talked about so far, that also is involved when he did this research of young people, is the fact that young people still see religion as a resource for stability and recovery. And so a lot of those young people that were so self-confident when they were leaving home and they were 18 years old, and now that they've made a few mistakes in their life and they realize their own mortality and they realize that they don't know everything like they thought they did, they see religion as a place that they can go and receive help. And so young people still, by and large, see religion in that way. And in the 4 years I've been at Alabama working with college students, I've seen a lot of young people who have realized that they don't have all the answers. And so they come to the elders. They come to mentors to come and receive help. And then the last one, this is the most heartening one to me as a parent. And this was something that was kind of unexpected to me when I was reading this book. But overwhelmingly, the most powerful influence on young people's lives today is the relationship that they have with their parents. They value how their parents see them more than anything else, more than their peers, more than the way their friends see them. They value what their parents think about them. And this is across the board, not just among kids who are religious, but irreligious kids. It still matters what their parents think about them. Now, they may be pushing back against their parents' faith and not following in the footsteps of their parents, but they still value what they think. And that is a hopeful thing for me. And so if I were addressing your parents, I would kind of go off in a different direction right now with a very hopeful message about what we need to be doing as parents. But I'm not talking to your parents, I'm talking to you. So what do you do with all of this? Well, I'll tell you what. You look at the statistics, and I hope that you see some hope in all of this, because it's not that when you leave home, you have no idea whether you're going to be faithful or not, because it's just not that way. Number one, because we serve a God who is greater than this world. He who is in you is greater than he who is in the world, 1 John tells us. But you look at studies like this, and you realize that there are some very key predictors that if we do the right things, if we put our faith into action, if we do the things that we've been talking about this weekend, that we can make our faith our own. I want to show you some of the research that came out of this. Here are the most important factors, and parental influence is number one. But here are the major, out of all these studies, all these interviews, here are the major factors that came out of this. If you want to look at whether or not a young person who is in the top 25% religiously when they're 13 to 18 are still going to be in that top 25% when they're 18 to 23, these are the factors that show up in most of the surveys, most of the interviews. You don't need to know these numbers, but I'm just kind of showing you. Parental religion, personal prayer, the importance of religious faith. If you're reading the scriptures, if you have supportive religious adults, which, by the way, is statistically more important than your peers. I believe it's great that we have weekends like this to get young people together. I think it's great that you have kind of a support group in one another here at Eastside or wherever you're coming from. But understand, more important is your parents, and even more important are less important than your parents, but more important than your peers are other adults in your life. And so think about that. How many relationships outside of your parents do you have with people who are adults? I want to encourage you. I'm going to tell, and I have told my kids, when they go to Auburn, don't just spend time with the young people. Get to know some other people who are older than you. That's a hard thing when you're a young person, right? You've always been surrounded. You've been going to school. You've been surrounded by young people. It's kind of awkward and it's a little uncomfortable to have conversations with someone who is older than you. But you'll be surprised how many adults are open and receptive and really want that kind of relationship with you. And so this is an important factor. Religious experiences, that would be like a conversion, and then having few doubts about your beliefs. Now, of course, none of these things happen in isolation. What happens when you start combining these things? No one just reads their Bible and that's the whole source of their faith. What happens when you combine these factors? Well, if you have these bottom three, the least important of the seven, the number is 60%. When you take the top four, parental religion, personal prayer, importance of religious faith, and you read the scriptures, it's 84%. Now, of course, I want it to be 100%, right? But what if we look at this negatively? What if we say of the young people 13 to 18 years old who are in the top fourth of those who take their religion seriously, how many end up in the bottom fourth when they go into their emerging adulthood years? This is what the numbers show. It's a very low number of kids that just go off the cliff and they completely lose their faith. Don't believe in God anymore. Don't believe in Jesus anymore. And when you combine them, this is what you get. Just these bottom three, supportive religious adults, religious experiences, and no doubts about beliefs, less than 1%. And if it's the top four, it's less than 0.5%. Which is to say, your faith works. As scary as the world is, if you do these things, which is, you're doing all these things this weekend, right? You're surrounded by Bible teaching, and we're engaged in prayer, and you're engaging with an adult, at least one adult right now. And we're involved in things that are creating positive religious experiences. Your faith will sustain you. It does work. And you don't need statistics to tell you this. The fact of the matter is, we're seeing empirical research that just supports what the Bible's already told us. One of my favorite characters in the Old Testament is Daniel. And the reason why I love Daniel is because I can relate to Daniel. I can't relate to him in every way. In some ways I can, in other ways I have no idea what it was like to be Daniel. Can you imagine Not just going off to school, not just being separated from your family, but being forcibly taken to a foreign land where you don't even speak the language. You don't understand the culture. You are being presented with temptations, food that you've never eaten or been presented with before. And you're being indoctrinated. You're given a different name. Your name no longer reflects a belief in God. Your name now reflects belief in foreign gods. That's what those new names meant. They were reflective of their new life and their new identity as servants of Babylon, servants of their gods. And they answered to those names. And so imagine what that would feel like if all of a sudden your name went from being John to being Mohammed, and you're having to learn Arabic, and you're having to answer to people who you don't understand at all, not just language, but in any way. And now you've got to make the choice. I am not supported by a lot of other influences like my family or my church. I'm now having to stand on my own. Well, why did Daniel and his friends not abandon their faith? Well, we're given some clues in Daniel. Chapter 6 and verse 10 gives us a very important clue. This is not when Daniel is a young man, by the way. He is 70 years later, probably in his 80s or 90s by this point. But in Daniel chapter 6, where this law was given that said no one could pray to any other god except for the king for 30 days, for 30 days, what did Daniel do? Daniel 6 and verse 10, when Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem, and he prayed, and he gave thanks, as he had done previously. Daniel didn't forget who he was. Now, think about this. When he prayed with his windows open toward Jerusalem, you understand the reason why he's doing that is because Solomon had prayed to God at the dedication of the temple that if the people are taken away from the land and they pray toward this place, toward the temple, that God would hear their prayer and respond. And so Daniel is praying toward Jerusalem for that reason. But you understand that the temple is no longer there. The temple by this time has long been destroyed. And yet Daniel still knew who he was. He was in exile. He was in a foreign land, speaking a different language, serving at this time under a totally new regime. And yet he still had preserved and kept his identity. He knew who he was. Why was that? It's because of prayer, personal prayer. James begins and ends with talking about prayer. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. If anyone lacks wisdom, let him ask of God. I hope that every single one of you are personally engaged in prayer right now. Prayer is one of those defining acts where you personally decide who you are. And I'm not talking about praying before meals with the family when your dad calls on you to lead a prayer. Not even talking about praying in contexts like this. I'm talking about when nobody else is around. Jesus said, when you go into your inner room, right? And it's just you and God. That's where your relationship with God begins. Is speaking to your God as your Father. And knowing that He hears your prayer. And something very important happens in that transaction. Where your faith becomes real. I was in a preacher study one time. There's about 30, 40 preachers, and we were going through the Psalms, and the class was such that it just was an open discussion, and we talked about prayer in general. And there were several different guys as we were talking about one aspect of prayer that made the comment that they'd never learned to pray until they went through some tragedy in their life. Their wife found out that she had cancer, or there was a dire financial situation or something like that. And I was not feeling very good about my prayer life at the time. I was preaching, by the way, at that time. But I didn't really feel like I had an intimate prayer life, or that my prayer life was what it needed to be. I remember going to another preacher that I knew was a very prayerful man. And I asked him, I said, do I have to wait until I go through some tragedy in my life to learn how to pray? And this preacher, a good friend of mine, his eyes welled up with tears, and he said, David, don't wait until you go through a trial before you learn how to pray. Because what happens when you go through a trial and you don't have that connection with God? You don't have that prayer life that you need. Are you going to pray? I hope you do, but how do you know if you don't have that ongoing conversation with God? There's an awkwardness in calling a friend when you haven't spoken to him in years and you're asking for help. You know what I'm talking about? It's kind of weird when you do that. But it's different when you have a relationship with them. And the fact is, God wants to hear from us. He wants that kind of relationship with us. So I want to encourage you right now to start making your faith your own. And I'm sure that many of you are already doing this. But if you're not, resolve that you're going to work your faith. It's going to be something real to you, where you talk to God regularly in prayer. Another thing we see Daniel doing is he made very specific, very intentional decisions in his life about how he's going to live. Of course, we begin in chapter 1 when Daniel and his friends are presented with food that was not right for them to eat, whether it was sacrificed to idols or whether it was just unclean, we don't know. But whatever it was, Daniel resolved in his heart that he would not defile himself with that food or with that wine. And I tell you, you're going to have to make that decision in your life. And you're going to have to decide that you're going to do this, you're going to do what's right no matter what anybody else is doing. Because the fact of the matter is, there may have been some other Hebrew boys who did not eat and drink. But it's possible that Daniel and his friends were the exception and not the rule. The fact is, when you go off to college, there may be some times where you're out with your friends who are all Christians, and they start doing some things that you're like, I shouldn't be doing that. And it's at that point that you're going to have to decide what you really believe. Because you're not going to have mom and dad around. And you're not going to have the support of people who are all encouraging you to do the right thing or not do the wrong thing. You're going to have to make a tough choice. There was one student at Alabama that graduated just recently, and he had not told this story before to my knowledge, but I think it was during an invitation right before he graduated. He talked about what happened the very first weekend he came to Alabama. And he was on the cross-country team, and his buddies that were on the team, and they were all rooming together in the dorm. The very first night, they went out, and he thought they were just going to go out and have some fun, whatever. They all got wasted. And he had a decision to make. And he chose wisely. But it was a very lonely choice. It was a very difficult decision. That's tough when you're 18. And so I want you to embrace, James 1 talks about how trials shape us and mold us and perfect in us the faith that we have. Embrace those challenges as opportunities. When you're presented with an uncomfortable situation, don't shy away from that. Stand up and decide what you believe. That's where you form that identity that will be so important in influencing the rest of your life. I can't help but think about Daniel when he was a young man in chapter 1, when I read about him in chapter 6 making that difficult stand. One helped him be strong in the other situation. And of course he had his friends. And so choose your friends wisely. Daniel knew where to go. He knew who would pray with him and for him when he was presented with a tough situation in life. Embrace good, godly people who will encourage you in your faith. 1 Peter chapter 3 was written to people in the first century who were going through similar trials. And a lot of carryover between Daniel and 1 Peter. He refers to a lion in chapter 5. He talks about fiery trials in chapter 1 and chapter 4 of 1 Peter. He addresses them from Babylon, whether that was literal Babylon or Rome. Doesn't really matter. The point is, he was writing to people who were exiles, just like Daniel and his friends. In fact, that's the way he refers to them in chapter 1 and verse 1. And in chapter 2 and verse 11, he says, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul." And in chapter 3, he talks about a very practical issue of the way that you dress. And I think that the way you dress is an important identifying mark. It's where you make the decision, am I like the world? Am I like everybody else? Or am I going to be distinct? Am I going to be different? Hey, we just got back from Orlando. I know how the world dresses or doesn't dress. It's different, right? Well, how do you make that decision as a young person? How do you dress? Well, look at what he says in 1 Peter 3 and verse 3. He says, "Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair, or the putting on of gold jewelry, or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious." In God's sight, it's very precious. And you know, that's all that matters, is how God sees you. That is how you make your faith your own. When you make up your mind, you know, James 1 talks about pure religion before God the Father. All religion that is pure is before God. It's not about what everybody else sees. It's not what everybody else thinks, what your mom and dad think, what your grandparents think, what Eastside thinks. It's what God thinks about you. That's what matters. That's the most important decision in forming your identity. So let me just close with a little story for you to illustrate that. We've had several last concerts and last games and things like that this year with the kids. And for us, soccer was always a big thing. Anna, our oldest, ever since she was 5 years old, has played soccer. It was a very difficult thing for me to go back, and I started putting all this slideshow together for their graduation party. And one of the things was I watched their first soccer game. Again, here they were running all over the place, not knowing what they were doing, but having a blast. You know, that whole year, the first year of soccer, they didn't lose a single game. I mean, they won every single game. We were thinking, this is so easy, right? But the last game that Anna played, she lost in. It was in the state tournament, and they didn't lose by just a little. They lost big time. They played a very tough team. Like 4 girls in that team have already committed to SEC schools, and so they just got destroyed. But I told Anna after, and she cried like a baby. And she's not a girl that cries, so don't tell her that I told you that she cried. But she cried like a baby at the end of that game. And it wasn't just that it was her last game, it was the fact that they lost so badly. I told her later, I said, "Hon, I want you to know that I was rejoicing in the way that you played that last game as much as any game I ever saw you play, because she kept playing all the way to the end. She played hard. I mean, she continued running, and a parent came up to us after and came up to her and said, "I'm just so impressed with the way you played so hard." I hope that that's what matters most to her. And I hope that's what matters the most to all of us when it comes to our religion. Ultimately, making your faith your own is when you make the decision that all that matters is that I please God, and He's happy with me. And of course, you nurture that by beginning the conversation in prayer and studying His Word, listening to God, responding to Him, not just talking about religion, but doing, visiting the orphans and the widows, doing good works, making your faith real, religion pure. But doing it not so that people can see you doing it, not so that you can get the applause, but doing it because you know that's what God wants you to do. And when we figure that out, that's when we've truly made our faith our own. So I hope that this has been helpful to you. We're going to have a closing prayer or